Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Aquarium of the Pacific. Even if you're here only virtually, I'm Jerry Schubel. We're here in person, and I'm the president, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here. I want to acknowledge our sponsors for our lecture series, Gazette Newspapers and Courtyard Marriott. Today, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. It was created in 1970 by Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin. He wanted to use some of the techniques that have been used by anti-war protesters to begin to develop a movement for the environment in the United States. On that first Earth Day, 20 million people participated. And today, as you know, it's celebrated all around the world. Here at the Aquarium for the past decade, we've hosted a weekend celebration for Earth Day, but this year that wasn't possible. So we wanted to do something, though, special to celebrate this and something special for all of you. And when thinking about what we could do, Douglas McCauley came to mind. He's a remarkable fellow. He's professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Marine Biology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's a Sloan Fellow in the Ocean Sciences, and he is the director of the Benioff Ocean Initiative. He's an outstanding research scholar and teacher, has the remarkable ability to integrate information across disparate fields, integrate it into a cohesive, comprehensive, and compelling story, and deliver those stories in an engaging way. Doug has been a great friend of the Aquarium. He helped us develop the stories for Pacific Visions. And so whenever we have a crisis, we turn to Doug McCauley. Please join me. You can clap virtually in your living rooms in welcoming our good friend, Professor Douglas McCauley. Doug?
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for the very kind introduction. And it's really, I must say, an honor to share some thoughts with you and share thoughts with all that are out there this evening on Earth Day, on our 50th anniversary of Earth Day. I wanted to maybe start our thinking off together about oceans, about where we've come, where we're going, and a little bit about thinking about oceans in this moment now with a quote from Shakespeare. Probably some of you recognize the connection between this quote and the title for the talk. But this quote that there is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. I think that's something we may wish to focus on. If we miss that flood, as Shakespeare warns, and of course this is Julius Caesar, that our life may be bound in shallows and in miseries. So we want the fortune, not the shallows and the miseries part. And as we were reflecting on this, which is one of my favorite ocean quotes, it felt very appropriate to the moment today, simply because things feel quite Shakespearean around us. I think probably many people are aware Shakespeare lived through his own pandemic, through the Black Plague, wrote and worked somehow through all of that. And this thought from Shakespeare, this thought from Julius Caesar, I think speaks to this moment, which is, at least to me, some amount of inspiration that like the tides, like in our oceans, the affairs of men go up and go down. We have good times, we have bad times. The tide rises, the tide falls. And we may not necessarily be able to do much about the waxing and waning of the good and the bad, except we have an opportunity to react to that cyclicity, to react to those cycles. And if we don't react, if we don't find those good moments or respond to those bad moments, we are more on a track for miseries and shallows than on track for fortune. I want to maybe provide another visual example of that opportunity to be resilient, that opportunity to look for and react to those ups and downs of life with this picture of a boat here on the screen. Now, probably some of you know, we've shared in some past visits to the aquarium that there have been a lot of boats in my life. It's a privilege, somebody who works with oceans, to be shaped by many boats. My first career, my first job on the oceans down in Long Beach and Port of Los Angeles was working on fishing boats. So a lot of early formative experiences with boats right behind the aquarium. And this boat, my sailboat here in the left, is actually a sailboat that found its way into my life when I was moved from becoming a fisherman to studying marine science at the university. It's a bilge-keeled sailboat, and I have to confess to you all here that I'm actually a pretty bad sailor, and this sailboat was a perfect fit for me for one design reason. You can see that there on the bottom. A bilge keel is sort of like a pair of stabilizing legs, which make a bilge keel sailboat terrible for racing, but wonderful if you're a bad sailor. If, for example, hypothetically, you were to take such a sailboat and not necessarily pay attention to the patterns of the tides, your nautical charts, and you find yourself in shallower water than you anticipated, why it just stands, which is a good feature, a resilient feature, a strong feature for a boat. And it stands until the flood tide returns. You wait, be strong, maybe you call your mom a bunch of times, and you wait some more, and then that tide comes back and you're sailing again, which the coupling of these words from Shakespeare, the inspiration from the resiliency, how to deal with the ups and downs of life, such as they are, as we get from the design of sailboats to life, I think for me felt a lot like how I was looking out at this moment in time at our ocean past and our ocean future. Now, what I want to share with you, I want to start by sharing with you tonight are a few thoughts about hope and optimism. I'm going to warn you, I'll start with a less than happy image, and then we'll transition from there to a happy image. And the reason that I wanted to start with a few of these stories of resiliency for you from the oceans, and hope from the oceans, and optimism from the oceans, is because I think at least I wanted to relearn a few of those stories as my own kind of ocean therapy in this moment. Because there's a whole lot I've always found when you go back to the ocean, there's a whole lot of inspiration to draw from it, and certainly a lot in some of these low tide moments, if you will. First example, that boat when I was going to grad school was actually moored and in Monterey. And this is Monterey. Probably many of you know this landscape well. Some of you may know that when explorers first arrived, European explorers first arrived to Monterey Bay, that they found it a wealth of vast biological resources. There were whales and dolphins and pinnipeds and fish as far as the eye could see. In fact, a quote from a French explorer sticks with me, where he talks about the stench of whales being the thing he remembered as he sailed into Monterey Bay, because there were so many whales in this bay. Now, these explorers and their children and those that settled from this exploration took too much of that vast natural wealth, too many of the whales and the pinnipeds. And we're looking here at a scene of Monterey. This is Cannery Row and the frontage of Monterey, which is the peak of that period of taking, again, too much from the sea, perhaps thoughtlessly, perhaps not with the guidance of science or even just prudent action. This is a scene when there is a new kind of stench in the town of Monterey, and it's not the breath of bountiful pods of whales, but the breath of effluent coming out of canneries that are in peak industrial operation and taking too much, in this case, sardines from the ocean, that putting too much back in this case, pollution into Monterey Bay. A low point in the ecological history of this one special ocean place. Now, when I was there in that sailboat, it was a very different scene. So the scene that I saw from my boat was much more like what the first explorers saw. That's fast forwarding about 70 years from the true low point, the crash in Cannery Row, when we absolutely took, in fact, too much. When we took too many sardines, the fishery collapse coupled with some climate change caused all of those canneries to shut down, the entire economy in Monterey to shut down. Now, waiting with some patience, with some thoughtful ocean management, fast forwarding 75 years to when I was a resident of Monterey, again, it was a place where the stench was back, but the good stench, the stench of whales. In fact, it was more the stench of sea lions where my boat was moored. But that happy richness, the diversity, the abundance of life being really the hallmark of Monterey again. Not only, a mount of resiliency and vibrancy and biologic richness back in the bay, but a lot of the wealth that people were pursuing from first explorers to the owners of those canneries. But the wealth was coming in sort of a different form. There's still fisheries and healthy fisheries in Monterey, making a living and a living with the guidance of science, sustainably fishing in this space, but also wealth for people that want to go out there and see all of that life being wild and being in place alive in the bay. So really wonderful story about the life and the death of this place. And in fact, there's a wonderful book called The Life and Death of Monterey for people who want to hear that story of resiliency and that story of hope in greater detail. A couple more stories of hope and resiliency for us in this moment. This is my least, remember I said we'll start with a bad picture and then go to a good picture. This is my least favorite picture of sea otters. These are pelts of sea otters. Probably many of you know that sea otters are at least reputed to be the fuzziest, the furriest animal in the entire world. Maybe a million hairs per square inch on a sea otter. Now that wonderful fuzziness that makes them so cute and endearing to all of us made them very, very attractive during the fur trade, during the fur rush in early California, when we had people from all over the world landing in California to capitalize on the bounty of fur floating offshore in the kelp forests of California and overcapitalize. In fact, hunt sea otters so intensively that many people across California actually believe that we had driven every single last sea otter in the California population totally extinct. To some hope and to a much better picture of sea otters. Happily, a family of sea otters, a raft of sea otters of about 50 individuals, was a well-kept neighborhood secret in Big Sur. So in the rugged coast where it's very difficult for hunters to access, where you can hide just about anything, their hiding was this decent-sized group of sea otters. And that little bit of hope, that little bit of success was enough to repopulate the entire population of sea otters across California. So now we're up to about 3,000 sea otters in the state, which is a wonderful source of inspiration, a wonderful story of recovery from bottoming out. It's like coming back to something that's a lot more positive, right? Nothing gets worse than perhaps this story. I moved from thinking about temperate systems in California, cold water systems, spent a lot of time thinking about the ecology and biology of warmer water places of coral reefs. There is no worse abuse that I think we've enlisted or inflicted upon a coral reef or any part of the world than an atomic bomb. During the 40s and 50s, the United States detonated some 60 plus atomic bombs on this particular coral reef in Bikini Atoll. You can imagine when you blow up 60 plus atomic bombs above the water, below the water, that devastates, completely resets an entire ocean ecosystem, all of the reefs in that space. Now, because of the radioactivity from all of that tremendous and terrible disturbance in Bikini Atoll, we also left the place almost completely be. And if we fast forward 50 years from that remarkably intense disturbance event, scientists that go back there now to Bikini Atoll actually don't see an atomic wasteland underwater. You see the regrowth of corals. You see some of the largest coral reef fish populations and shark populations in the world. So we see a remarkable story for us of resiliency when we leave nature alone to allow itself to heal. One last story of abuse and healing in the theme of optimism and resiliency from our oceans. And this one is very apropos of the day and close to home for me in Santa Barbara. Probably some of you may remember 1969 as being a dark day for the oceans, dark day for California and ocean history. Offshore oil platform, which is drilling off the coast of California, had pressure build up behind a less than well-maintained well, and it actually so much pressure that it cracked the seafloor. A gigantic plume of oil and gas came out, and this large plume of oil that was leaking from this fractured and broken well, and eventually created a slick that spread to about the size of the city of Chicago across the ocean. And then as the waves and winds started blowing seasonally here in Santa Barbara, as they do, brought much of this oil into the harbor, which is what we're looking at here, an unfortunately oiled and devastated scene in Santa Barbara Harbor in 1969. Now let's go to a happier image of Santa Barbara Harbor. This is me with a happier set of young offspring in my family, enjoying a clean, a resilient, and a much recovered Santa Barbara Harbor. If we move forward 50 years, we see a lot of the ecology that was essentially erased or deeply impacted by all of this disturbance in the oil now recovered. Healthy seabird communities, healthy pinniped communities, healthy intertidal communities, and all the rocks in this harbor. And the connection to today, of course, as Jerry mentioned, is that 1970 was when we launched for the first Earth Day. In part, at least part of the inspiration for kickstarting Earth Day was the fact that we had seen a series of these catastrophic disturbances we thought we never could be capable of delivering to our planet, including the Santa Barbara oil spill, which prompted us to reset our thinking, 2 million of us together on this day 50 years ago, reset our thinking and our commitment to seeing less of these disasters for our planet. Okay, so a little bit of shared ocean therapy in terms of stories of recovery from dark times, stories of resiliency from the super healing powers and healing potential that is our oceans, and a little chance to think backwards in time about some of the history of our impact on the oceans. But I want us today, Earth Day is as good a day as any, to think forward about what will our legacy become for the oceans in the future. So we have some of these very dark disturbance events in the past, and I want to point out that a very important lesson to take from these stories of resiliency is not that we can abuse the ocean, we can't blow up atomic bombs, and we can't dump oil into the ocean, and we can't overfish our ocean heedlessly and intend the ocean always to recover itself. There are unfortunately a large set of darker stories where the ocean has not healed itself, but that's for another lecture and a slightly more a better time perhaps. But we can't infinitely damage the ocean and expect the ocean to heal itself. What we can learn from those historical stories, from looking back at those stories of recovery, are a couple things. We can certainly learn that it takes an awfully long time for the ocean to heal itself. So we don't want to put ourselves in the situation in the first place. Remember, it took 50, 75 plus years to see recovery from some of these mega disturbances that we created. Now that's a shutdown of ocean economies and a complete removal of people from ocean places for a very, very long time. I think we all can appreciate, after seeing shutdowns of a few weeks, a matter of days, that we can't bear to see ocean economies. We can't bear to see coastal communities shut down for years at a time. That's not sustainable for our economy, for jobs, for wealth, for the food that we take from the ocean. So that's not untenable. It is not tenable to keep delivering these insults to the ocean. What I think we can learn from looking back, as we begin this exercise today about looking forward, is that if we act fast enough, if we act smart enough, if we act together collectively, fast, smart, and intelligently enough, we can in fact see our efforts be matched by the healing power, the resilience of the ocean to actually see recovery take place. Now, the impacts that we've had on the oceans, as I've mentioned so far in the past, have been very severe, but the things I'd like to point out is that the future ahead of us stands to be, the impact we have on the oceans, the footprint we'll have on the oceans, stands to be even more, much more significant than any of the impacts we've ever had in the past 50, in the past 100 years in our oceans. And I think the impacts we may have and the decisions we make going forward from the 50th anniversary of Earth Day may actually take us to space that have truly unimaginable consequences on the future of our oceans. But they are consequences that we still can shape and still must shape today. And when I say sort of unimaginable impacts and unimaginable consequences on our oceans, that's actually saying something significant, because much of the impact and the influence we've had on our oceans thus far in the past, the last 50 or 100 years, has been in many ways unimaginable. So if we, for example, had been having a Zoom call in a cave together 1 million years ago as sort of early start humans, and I had suggested to you that we might be a dominant ecological force on the planet, you would have just laughed at me across our Zoom call. It is so unthinkable biologically that a species like ours, which is made for influencing land, a terrestrial species, would actually be able to extend its own ecological influence out in the oceans with such force as to reshape an entire, the biggest part of our planet, 2/3 of our planet. But indeed we did that. and especially did that through the influence of fishing. We are, just as I might have suggested a million years ago, a superpower, a super predator in our oceans in terms of our impact of fishing. You get a sense of the ways that we've actually extended our own phenotype, our own biology, our own ecology into the oceans here, in a large way aided by technology, in our influence as fishers, reshaping ecology along the way of our oceans. You get even more of a sense of that superpower influence, that super predator influence that we've had. Looking at a chart like this is actually a map of signal transmissions from fishing vessels all across our planet, showing that in fact we are, in 1 year's time, we're fishing in just about everywhere on our planet except on dry land. That's what all the blue and green lights are. And that just gives you, I think, a really raw sense of how influential and how large our footprint is in respect to fishing on our planet. But perhaps fishing is just the tip of the iceberg. And maybe that's what I want to suggest to us today. And I think the reason it's just the tip of the iceberg is that we're now doing so many more new things in the oceans than we've ever done before. We've suggested here in this picture new kinds of activities that may have more of an influence on an ocean future than ever before. So we're doing things like farming in the oceans. We're building ocean highways. We're proposing to mine in the oceans. We're building power plants in the oceans. And these could be game changers for ocean health, for ocean biodiversity, for our ocean future. They may also be the exact thing we need to help shape positively our ocean futures, as we need more food, need clean energy from our ocean, from the oceans around us. Just to give you a sense of this pace of growth here, I'm showing you a handful of different charts in this sort of ocean Anthropocene or industrial revolution that just seems to be slowly but surely rising like a tide in the oceans around us now. So oil and gas and energy, we talked about shipping, aquaculture, mining, coastal development, cruise and tourism, desalination, construction desalination plants, installations of submarine cables, millions of kilometers of cables reaching back and forth our oceans across our continents. All of this is a whole lot of new human stuff and a whole lot of new human influence that we're putting in the oceans very, very, very rapidly, as you can see in the exponential curves in each of these different kinds of new ocean industry. But the ocean industry is also providing new food, new wealth, new income to a vibrant blue economy. I think the challenge in front of us in the next 50 years, as we look forward from Earth Day, is how to get the good from all of this development and leave behind some of the bad. There's maybe a point of reflection here as we look head down on Manhattan, right? We can see the intense amount of change in this one little chunk of our planet that we've engineered on land. And the oceans, not a whole lot yet of that footprint. In fact, last year, people observed about 250 whales in the waters near New York City. If you went onto land in New York City, in and around this matrix of buildings, I promise you did not see 250 megafaunal mammals roaming around. There's been a whole lot of change on land. I'm suggesting there'll be a whole lot of change soon in the oceans. And I am suggesting that, as Brutus was warning in the quote from Julius Caesar, we need to be aware that perhaps change is afoot, that a tide is shifting here, and be prepared to act ahead of that to make sure this comes out as fortune and not misery. So I shared this notion a second ago about this being on pace with the feel of an industrial revolution, right? And exactly how, when I look out at some of these graphs and look out at some parts of the oceans, how I feel, an industrial revolution beginning in our seas. And the industrial revolution, as it occurred on land, was a moment of really exciting progress. It's a time we cranked out all kinds of new medicines, created new jobs, created a lot of new products, which set us on really firm footing to be successful and healthy as societies. But at the same time, we were sort of thoughtlessly pushing out externalities that were not so great for our environment outside of these factories. This is an image of the Cuyahoga River, where my mother grew up, near where my mother grew up in Ohio. They caught fire not once, they caught fire 13 times before we sort of got the memo that, wow, we want the good from all of this growth, but we want to leave behind some of that bad too. So how do we do that for the oceans if we have this chance looking forward from today to a next 50, 100 years in our oceans? How do we get the good without the bad? Well, we have a number of strengths and advantages, perhaps having this green industrial revolution come online a little bit later in the ocean than it did on land. And one of those is that we have a whole lot of very smart, very powerful tools, technological tools, for trying to both see this new kind of change unfold around us near real time, often real time in our oceans, and to shape that influence and to be engineers of that future as it unfolds. And there are no silver bullets, I think, in where we go and how we manage the future of the oceans, but I think certainly a valued asset as we look forward to shaping that future is going to be relying on the strength of some of these tech-based tools. So in the theme of sharing optimistic messages today, I just want to give you a flavor of the ways that as we look forward, as we act forward together to shape what becomes of our oceans in the future, ways that we can leverage the power of technology to help that future come out a little bit smarter, a little bit better, and help that good come to us faster. So a handful of examples of applying technology to shape our ocean future. This is an image not of baby satellites being born. This is an image of microsatellites being ejected from a large satellite, which just is one example of a technology that helps us learn more, do more, see more, act smarter for our oceans. We have this new constellation of satellites that's in orbit around all parts of our planet, land and sea, that helps us see more and learn more about what's happening in our oceans. One example, I showed you the fixed and static sensor data that comes from this network. Actually, now animating some of that data. This is those microsatellites that we're looking at. Many of them have sensors on them, which is picking up these transmissions from fishing vessels, which allows us to know where fishing vessels are operating in the seas, and allows us to do some clever things for ocean conservation with all of that data when it's thoughtfully processed. This is billions and billions and billions of data points. But when you actually work your way through that using some smart machine learning algorithms, you can do some cool things for ocean conservation, do cool things to shape what the future of our oceans becomes. Here's an example. I'm showing you here on the part of the screen with lots of lights on, data from a protected area that's about the size of California in the middle of the ocean. It's a protected area that belongs to a country called Kiribati. 6 months before they closed fishing in this region. And there's all the lights you see on are transmissions that are coming through this constellation, coming to me as I'm watching this, all this data come to us in the lab here in Santa Barbara. And just as you'd imagine, before they closed this protected area to give some breathing room for ocean biodiversity and space, there's a lot of fishing that's happening out there. After the closure, which is the empty scene, and after the closure, we actually were able to see that the protected area did just what we hoped it would do. We saw many of the fishing vessels leave the protected area. And we did, though, see a few anomalous observations. One of those is the blue squares you see in the center of the white field, which is a putative illegal fishing activity inside this marine park, protected area. So in the group we were working with called Global Fishing Watch, we shared this data. They shared this data onto the country Kiribati that was looking after this protected area. They used this data to actually build a case in court against these illegal fishers and fine them $1 million that came into a place that could really use $1 million for ocean conservation. So a good example of how you can actually use technology to do ocean problem solving, and a good hopeful example. Let me show you another hopeful example. So I was, again, sitting in my office here at Santa Barbara, and I got a call from the National Park Service. And they said, hey, Doug, you're a marine biologist. Well, we're having an issue. We've got a whale stuck in the harbor, and surely you know what to do because you are a marine biologist. And I thought, okay, well, there must be something I can do to help. Thought as I was racing down there, well, what is the key motivator for a whale, particularly a young whale like this? This is a young humpback whale. And in fact, biology instructs us that young whales are motivated by some of the same things that our undergraduates are actually motivated by. I have lots of experience with undergraduates. They're motivated by two main drivers, food and sex. This is too young a whale to worry about the latter, so I thought food. And what we ended up doing was playing on that biological cue, actually literally play upon it, going out to the mouth of the harbor, putting down a set of underwater speakers and playing all night long. This is still reverberating in my head sometimes when I try to go to sleep, playing all night long the foraging call of humpback whales, which the young humpback heard and found his way out of the harbor, which to me thought, okay, well, this is kind of a cool case of how you might be able to use technology to problem solve, but maybe we're just scratching the surface here on how to leverage the power of technology to help whales. So let me show you a optimistic story. We'll move away from this picture, a story that relates to resolving the problem of whales becoming roadkill for ships. Remember the ocean highways that I mentioned a moment ago that are becoming busier and busier? Well, unfortunately, we have roadkill on those ocean highways. So this is just an example of a system that we're putting together right now. It uses a bunch of different thoughtful technologies from a lot of very talented ocean scientists at Scripps, at UC San Diego, at UC Santa Cruz, at Woods Hole, that worked together to design this system to try to detect whales and tell the ships when there are whales on these highways, so the ships can slow down and reduce the likelihood of running over these whales. We listen for the calls of whales, use machine learning to automatically detect when they're out there calling. We're looking again from outer space, from satellites, trying to predict and see when there's good whale habitat to be able to build kind of weather forecasts for whales. And we're leveraging through a thoughtful app sightings from citizens that are out there on whale watch vessels, always looking for whales, and then integrating information and sending it to the ships. So it's an exciting other example of how we can be clever about using good, smart people and using good, smart technology to problem solve in the oceans. One more example here with one of my favorite fish, and one of my favorite fish to watch when I'm in the aquarium. Probably many of you that are aquarium, the Pacific enthusiasts, know this fish well from the Blue Cavern, the giant sea bass or black sea bass. Well, I am infinitely curious about fish. And one of the things we really want to do is learn more about this fish because it's as endangered as a rhino. It's deeply overfished and is only beginning to show the slightest bit of good news in its recovery. Very little is known about it. So we went out and tried to catch this fish, again thinking, okay, well, we have some pretty exciting tiny sensors. We could probably stick on this fish if we could just catch it. This is a big fish, as I hope the image here provides evidence of, and we were simply having a very rough time catching this fish. It kept besting us in all sorts of situations. And as I was sort of frustrated at home looking at fish online, learning more about them, trying to figure out how I might do a better job of successfully capturing one, I realized that there were images everywhere, and talked to actually some people at the aquarium about the popularity of this fish to divers. This is just a mosaic of all of these images I was finding online for people posting on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, pictures of this giant sea bass. And actually in conversation with people at the aquarium, we thought, well, actually, do we need to stick a technology and a tag on this fish? Has it actually already been tagged 1,000 times and more, 100,000 times over online with these photos? Well, we spent a moment trying to figure out whether the tags were actually static, whether we could actually identify a fish from a picture. Could you use the spots on a giant sea bass to actually identify a unique individual? And we learned that actually you can use a really interesting algorithm that people use to identify stars in space, to identify these patterns on the giant sea bass, unique patterns like a fingerprint on the fish, and track where they go. So we eventually, without even needing to catch the fish, had caught the fish 1,000 times over and learned a lot about how it moves, how it uses some of these ocean parks, and a little bit more about its biology and its recovery. So really neat additional example, I think, for me about how, if we're thoughtful, we can help sort of engineer this future with technology as our ally. All right. I would be remiss in a conversation as we think forward about what will the future of the ocean bring on Earth Day. I would be remiss not to mention climate change. It's really the gorilla in our underwater ocean room, right? It is the primary driver of what may shape the future of our oceans. Of course, as many of you know, climate change is causing our oceans to become hotter, to become more acidic, and it's actually driving oxygen as a result of ocean water heating up in the sea. And that is sort of akin for anyone who keeps aquariums at home, as if you were to take your home aquarium with fish in it and you were to turn the bubbler off, you were to slowly drip acid into this aquarium, or you were to crank up the heater in the aquarium. we can, without running that experiment at home, know what disastrous consequences that would have for life in an aquarium. And bit by bit, slowly but surely, this is precisely what we're doing with climate change to our oceans. If history, again, instructs us about the future of the oceans, history tells us that climate change, in the deep history of our oceans, deep histories of our planet, climate change that began and occurred unrelated to humans, well before humans, was the thing that precipitated the biggest extinctions in the oceans, the biggest extinctions, in fact, that our planet has ever seen. So as a piece of history we want to leave in the past, we do not want to recreate now at the hands of humanity. So it's just one illustration. I gave you a few examples: the acidification, the temperature and overheating, and the loss of oxygen. Let's see if I can get this to play. This is just an example here of, we need to save it for another day. Example here of coral being exposed to weak acid vinegar, home vinegar. What you would see, and I can actually post this video online, what you would see here in this experiment is that when we put this piece of coral in a higher acidic environment, this is more acidic than the ocean will ever get, but it very rapidly shows you what happens. You start to see bubbles coming off this coral, which is evidence of this calcium carbonate actually simply dissolving in this higher acidity environment, which is samples for us the devastating physiological and chemical effects this ocean acidification have on ocean ecosystems. We may lose corals as a result of this slow but sure increase in acidity in the oceans. And not only do we lose corals, but corals are the rainforests for our oceans, harboring millions of species. So if we lose corals, then unfortunately we lose this habitat, which is home to so many of these other species, which is precisely and unfortunately why we saw with these ocean acidification, these climate change events in the past, such mass loss of species on our ocean, in our oceans and on our planet. So again, simply want to leave well in the past. Now, a last thought before we pull some of our thinking together as it relates to climate change is that a conversation about where we go from today, where we go in the next 50, 100 years, certainly must involve climate change, but that isn't just about doing the right thing for our friends in the oceans and their homes. It's very much a conversation as well about doing the right thing for our own homes. We're looking here at a very tangible example about how climate change, if left uncontrolled, could literally impact our own homes. In the 3.3 degree warming scenario, I'm showing you how sea level rise may cause extreme inundation in and around Long Beach. We can compare that to a much more moderate forecast for the future of climate change, where we see probably manageable amounts of sea level rise, or there's certainly nothing quite as disruptive dynamic as what we might see in runaway warming. And of course, I think everyone is aware of the mechanism behind sea level rise and its connection to climate change. What happens, of course, is that when you heat up any fluid, it causes it to expand. So, for example, if you take a gallon of seawater or water or milk or whatever, and you heat it up at home, even if you increase the temperature a very small amount, you'll see a tiny increase in volume. The level of that fluid will go up in your milk jug. Now, that is a pretty dramatic effect when it's multiplied by all of the gallons of seawater that are in the massive ocean that wraps around us on our planet. Remember, 352 quintillion gallons of water in our oceans. So when we increase the temperature, increase the volume, that water has to go somewhere. And unfortunately, it comes too close to home. So the point here is that while the difference between 3.3 and 1.1 degrees of warming, as we think about the next 50, 100 years, may seem something we could deal with, ocean physics and the way that climate change affects our planet may very likely shape up to things that we do not, and scenarios in a future that we do not want to deal with and are too much for us to bear. All right, so as a point of reflection, thinking about some disturbances, some healing, thinking together about the future of our oceans, I think it's probably fair to say that if we had the impossible opportunity to go back to 1970, to go back to the first Earth Day, and if we could have made smarter, more aggressive, more collective decisions about how we wanted to manage the future of oceans, we might be in a slightly better place than we are today with the oceans. But I think actually, we have really good footing where we are right now to think about engineering a very healthy and a very positive future for the oceans on this 50th Earth Day. There's still an immense amount of opportunity, and I believe an immense amount of opportunity, even in the face of climate change, to change and to shape what that future of our ocean becomes. I'm sharing with you my view, which is that the next 50 years going forward from today are going to be probably the most influential 50 years in the entire history of our oceans. So if ever there was a point in history where we have opportunity and we have necessity and responsibility to make good decisions for our oceans, it is absolutely right now. The last thought that I really want to leave you with is my own happy thought. If you think about this responsibility for becoming good stewards, redoubling our commitment to thinking about shaping the oceans, perhaps with the help of good tech and strong technologies to do more and do and perform smarter action to healing our oceans. Perhaps as we're doing that smart action and fast action, we have the resilient power of the oceans that we've been in the ocean since time immemorial, and we've seen case after case of it coming forward and healing as we try. It stands ready to heal alongside us. I think there's a moment for happy reflection in this picture, which is just that I absolutely cannot wait to get back into the aquarium. It's my happy thought that, I spent a lot of good days in the aquarium with our family. This is not my family, because if I took a picture of my family in the aquarium, it would simply be a blur as they jet from exhibit to exhibit. But this slightly more well-behaved family seems to really be taking in an opportunity to learn from the oceans, to learn what we need from the oceans, to draw inspiration from the oceans, to relearn lessons of how much the oceans need us on this journey, how much we need the oceans. And I just can't wait to be back there, sort of remaking those same commitments as a community in this place that we all care about. And looking at these next generations and thinking about the significance of today, our 50th Earth Day, I think highlights some of the significance and importance of these decisions ahead of us. I would really, really like to think, even though I may not be around to see the 100th celebration of Earth Day 50 years going forward, really like to think the decisions we make today, decisions we make in the next 50 years, set these next generation, our kids, up with a legacy of ocean health, which is precisely what they deserve. So we'll leave you with that thought. And Jerry, I know you may have some questions. I'm really delighted to have a conversation with you, because I know you've also been thinking about these same questions long and hard.
Doug, thank you. You've given us lots to think about, and I agree with you. I think the next several decades, maybe 50 years, will be terribly important in determining what the future of the Earth and the ocean and humankind will be. And I think California ought to be the real leader in developing these strategies for human beings to live in harmony with the Earth during the Anthropocene. And I think to some extent we are on the land. In the ocean, I'm not so sure, because I think you have to be willing to try new things, to do experiments, carefully designed experiments that have off-ramps so if things go wrong. But I think we think we're protecting the environment by having such rigid permitting, and that I think it puts us at a real handicap, because I think it strangles innovation in the ocean. What's your take on that?
Well, I'm with you, Terry. I think sometimes, as we need to be bold experimenters in the lab, as we want to be bold experiments in private industry, we also want to be bold experimenters in the oceans. And I think that there are a lot of experiments that need to be had, and a lot of experiments that we're running in an intended or unintended way around us. I mean, think about all of those different axes of change, whether it's shipping or aquaculture or marine energy. These are not things that we want to say no to, right? These are things that we want to do the right kind of experiments, that we want to have, just like you said, the right kind of careful policy to figure out how to onboard in the ocean for success for us and for ocean health.
And I think it comes down to the misinterpretation, I think, of what's called the precautionary principle, that if you propose something new, if there's any potential risk involved, it's up to the proposer to demonstrate that there is no risk. And when Bob Frosch was the administrator of NOAA, he said, if you take the precautionary principle to the extreme, we would never do anything new. And a more rational approach is that you look at the risk associated with the new proposal in terms of how would it reduce the risk and the impact of what it would propose if it's successful. And that's what good experimentation should do. You know, you mentioned Kiribati. We're very involved with Kiribati and PIPA, which is the Phoenix Island Protected Area, which was that big white square that you shared. And our CFO, Anthony Brown, sits on the board of directors of the PIPA Trust. It's quite a remarkable story because that country took it upon themselves to create this. And it not only kept the foreign fleets out, it really restricted the fishing of their own people, and they depend so heavily on the ocean. But it's I think it's a great success story. Let's go
Jerry,
ahead.
if I may, just a really good exhibition of partnerships. I think Kiribati did something really important there. Technologists in universities, technologists in aquariums, ocean leaders, I think for us to create international partnerships to help reinforce, what is in some ways a sacrifice, or better put, an investment. We need to do this as an international collaboration. And I think Kiribati and Phoenix Islands Protected Area is a good example of how if we all work together, it comes out better.
And that's the only way we're going to solve some of these big issues is through partnerships, global partnerships. So when you think about the COVID-19, what lessons do you take away from that relative to the relationship that we have to the Earth and the ocean, and maybe to global climate change? What lessons do you take away?
Yeah, well, I think that's probably the exercise we're all running right now, is just trying to, how much we can learn from this, how to, when the tide rises again, as it will soon, as it must soon, how can we take these learnings and rise with it? Well, I have to say, I've been thinking a fair amount about climate change in this moment. Let me first say that any lessons that I have, I think, are interpreted in light of the absolute, devastating impacts of this disease, this pandemic on our planet. So I don't want to make too light of positive things that are silver lining what is truly a global catastrophe. But in this dark moment, I'm searching for lessons. Looking at some of the things we're doing different in our own lives, things that I'm doing different in my own life. I'm actually living a very, very low carbon existence right now. I don't fly, I don't travel. Few of us, none of us, I expect, really are, which in some ways is an interesting opportunity to sample exactly what a low carbon life looks like. And there are things that we don't want to replicate. I'd certainly like to be at the aquarium next weekend. Right? But there are things perhaps we realize we could do without. I may not have needed to go to that conference that was canceled last week and came off perfectly well digitally, right? So I think it's a good opportunity for us to think about changes that we've been forced to make by this disease that we might want to hang on to, specifically as it relates to our own carbon footprints. And of course, with billions of people on the planet, small decisions like knocking a few flights off our annual calendar can add up. When you multiply it by 7, 8, 9 billion people in the near future, can add up to significant emissions cuts and significant change. Now, I do want to say again that what we want to learn is what is good from this moment, but the solution clearly is not shutting down the global economy and shutting down the local economy to get these benefits. What we want to learn, in the same way we're thinking about how to onboard this industry, get the good, do without the bad. We want to know how to turn back on blue economies on land, but perhaps be a little bit smarter in the way we turn them back on, in this case, specifically as it relates to our own emissions.
Yeah, I think the other lesson that I take away from this relative to climate change is both of these are global problems that require global solutions. Neither the virus nor greenhouse gases recognize any boundaries, whether they're national boundaries, political boundaries. And the only way we can solve these is through global cooperation. And we ought to be doing a better job, I think, of exhibiting leadership in that arena.
Exactly. One thought that your quite on point comment reminds me of, Jerry, is just while I think there's a lot of opportunity to search for retroactively for better international action and collaboration, there is something impressive in what we've done. This collective action, at a moment's notice, almost, to decide for the best, for public health, for the good of humanity, for the good of our healthcare workers, for the good of our own well-being and our own safety, that we need to do this thing as catastrophically different thing. We basically all need to work together to in this case, stay at home, right? I don't know that we've ever had such a good example that humankind across countries, across states, can actually act together to do something so bold, right? I think you're right to point out that climate change will hit us just as hard down the road. It won't see borders. It won't see even borders, as we talked about in the case of sea level rise, borders of land and sea. And so knowing that we can be bold and be bold together in the face of these major disruptions, I think should arm us with confidence that in the face of climate change, we can be just as bold, in fact, must be just as bold, and in fact, must be just as bold early enough to make a difference. That's certainly something that we can look at and learn from this disaster.
And the reductions in air pollution of all kinds are quite remarkable. There was something that was written the other day that the avoided deaths in China from the improvement in air quality will rival the number of deaths caused by the COVID-19. Now, whether that gets validated or not, still, there has been a significant reduction of deaths or shortening of lives from the reduction of air pollution.
Right. Right. No, absolutely. I mean, I think that just to that point, that we certainly want China to start back up its factories as it is. But can we reflect in this moment about, is there a smarter way, even if it's a little pricier, to try to think about closer controls on air pollution and emissions, so that we actually have the jobs, the product, the trade, but not the deaths, not the lung disease, not the illness, alongside with all of those things we want from a vibrant economy. I think that it's a false dichotomy to say we have to have a vibrant economy, and alongside of that, we get all this environmental damage and externalities. I think we have a lot to learn about how to get the good and leave behind the bad from this particular situation as we reboot our economies, land and sea.
And I think that the blue economy, the so-called blue revolution, gives us an opportunity to demonstrate that we know how to do that. We don't want a repeat of the green revolution. It may have avoided the mass starvation that Malthus and Paul Ehrlich forecast, but it took a huge, huge toll on Earth that we've never quite recovered from. I like the World Bank definition of the blue revolution better than any others. It is that the blue economy is the sustainable use of ocean resources that benefit the livelihoods of people, jobs, etc., while preserving the health and integrity of ocean ecosystems. And I think we have many of the tools and the knowledge to do that. The question is, can we demonstrate it?
Well, we must, Jerry.
We must. That's right. Sometimes, Winston Churchill once said, when you do your best, sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes you have to do what's required. I think we have to do what's required. Doug, happy Earth Day. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to having you and your family come back soon and often. Thank you, and thank all of you for joining us. Good night, everyone.